Revenge with Karen.
I knew they never read my reports when Derek stood outside my cubicle, red in the face, pointing like I'd just been caught smuggling cocaine through the VPN. "You've been stealing company time-watching webinars again, haven't you?" he bellowed, loud enough to knock the sticky notes off my monitor. The whole office froze. I minimized the training screen on corporate compliance, ironically, one I'd scheduled for his required continuing ed hours next quarter, and looked up like I hadn't just spent the last hour mentally rehearsing this exact conversation. I calmly said, "It's mandatory under ISO Section 7.2. He didn't hear a word. He was too busy puffing out his chest like a dollar store dictator with a LinkedIn badge. Security walked me out 10 minutes later. No one made eye contact. Not even Megan from payroll. Once cried in my cubicle for an hour when her parrot died, and I held her hand like a damn therapist. My badge was deactivated. My inbox gone. I left behind a sealed envelope on Derek's desk labeled Q3 submission. See log, officer of record. The irony? It was due that Friday. And if you're wondering why I'm telling you this, it's because 95% of people hear stories like this and never subscribe or click the little thumbs up. But if you do, it helps more than you think. We're just a small team sharing stories that deserve to be heard, and maybe, sometimes, savored with popcorn. All right, back to the show. My name's Marcy Keller, and for 8 years I was the most invisible person in the building, unless the building caught fire or got sued. I worked in compliance and risk, a department so unsexy our holiday party was just a PDF that said don't drink and drive. The marketing folks got catered shrimp and TED Talk guest speakers. I got spreadsheets of continuing education units, SU, regulatory bulletins in all caps, and a cracked coffee mug that read keep calm and mitigate risk. I was the company's registered continuing education officer, nominated, verified, and filed with ISO and the state. Nobody remembered that part. Not until it was too late. My job was to ensure that every department stayed compliant with the standards. We needed to hold on to our ISO certification. That included scheduling CE hours, tracking updates, and submitting formal documentation to the standards body. You know, the stuff no one cares about until a 7-figure contract hinges on it. To everyone else, I was the woman who always had some webinar open and wore the same cardigan for 3 winters in a row. The company's external auditor, I was the reason their contracts were still valid. I didn't complain, not because I liked being overlooked, but because I knew what happened when people stopped paying attention. In my 3rd year, a forgotten training log had cost us a project with a municipal client. I'd learned my lesson then, so I watched the webinars. I compiled the manuals. I logged hours down to the minute. My digital calendar was a graveyard of acronyms. Even used my own sick days to attend compliance symposiums no one else could be bothered to sign up for. Because if I didn't, the machine stalled. That machine worked silently. I designed it that way. Automations, alert systems, pre-scheduled report drops, enough to keep the program running even if I got hit by a bus. But here's the kicker. When Derek showed up, a puffed-up MBA with more vision than understanding, took one look at the budget for my department and decided it was dead weight. Never mind that I'd single-handedly negotiated a 2-year renewal on our CE platform licenses for 40% below market. Never mind that I was the only person in the entire company listed with the standards agency as the officer of record. All he saw was a quiet woman watching non-revenue webinars. He didn't ask. He accused. Said things like, "This company has no room for slackers, and I want everyone laser-focused on revenue." He called it a new era of accountability. Said things like streamlining operations and leaning out the bureaucracy. Then he leaned me right out the front door. No formal transition. No delegation. No one even asked how to access the system. When HR reached out later asking if I'd be willing to provide documentation to ensure continuity, I sent one email back. Please refer to the Q3 submission folder as previously outlined. No one responded. That's when I knew they hadn't even opened the envelope. You can't tell a company they are about to trip over their own feet. They have to do it. Loudly, in public, on camera. And if you're very patient, you might just get a front row seat. Moment that earned me a silent legend status in 3 Slack channels and a whispered nickname in procurement happened on a Wednesday at 3:13 p.m. the time when Derek decided to detonate his own credibility. I was in the middle of a webinar titled ISO 9001 Clause Updates for Annual Review, navigating Section 7.2.1. Real edge-of-your-seat stuff, unless you happen to run a company whose $80M in federal contracts depended on staying certified. I was taking notes, as usual, prepping the quarterly submission binder. I'd even blocked the hour on my Outlook calendar, flagged required for ISO CEU log, CCing my own manager out of habit, like I always did. And that's when Derek barged in, flanked by that fresh-out-of-college executive assistant who always looked like she was suppressing a sneeze. He stood there, arms crossed like he was auditioning for the role of corporate jackass #2 in a bad Netflix series. "Are you seriously watching another webinar, Marcy?" His voice bounced off the walls like he'd practiced in front of a mirror. "Do you think this is billable time?" I didn't flinch. "It's continuing education hours for ISO compliance." That was the wrong answer. He turned to the open office like a game show host revealing the final prize. "See this, everyone. This is what we're cutting out. Non-billable hours. Slackers. You wonder why we missed Q2 projections? Because people like this are stealing company time. There were maybe 20 of us in that space." No one spoke. A few looked at their screens with newfound intensity, pretending to be in deep conversation with Excel. One guy physically rotated his monitor away from the scene like he could avoid being collateral damage if Derek opened fire. "Pack it up," Derek snapped. "Security's already been notified." I remember the way his words hung in the air like secondhand smoke. I didn't argue, I didn't beg, I didn't cry. I clicked the webinar closed, powered down my monitor, reached under my desk, pulled out a small manila envelope already addressed. Q3 Submission CEU Records Officer of Record. I placed it gently on his desk as I walked past. "The education records were due Friday," I said, my voice steady. "Be sure to submit." I don't think he even heard me. He was too busy high-fiving himself in his mind for his bold leadership moment. The security guards showed up 5 minutes later, apologetic and awkward, one of them muttering, "Think you'd be the one today." I smiled at him like a woman who already knew the ending. They walked me through the building like I was radioactive. Not a soul moved. Not one coworker looked up. It was like walking through a wax museum, except I could feel their shame wafting off them in waves. The next morning, Derek posted a company-wide email titled Realignment for Growth, Redefining Accountability. It had all the classic MBA gibberish, synergy, lean ops, Q4 pivot, and one key line that made me laugh out loud from my kitchen. "We are committed to maintaining high standards of compliance and operational excellence." Operational excellence. From a man who hadn't opened a single ISO document in his career unless it had a pie chart or a bullet list. But see, that's the thing about compliance. It doesn't shout. It doesn't post selfies or schedule all-hands Zooms. It just is, or it isn't. When it isn't, everything breaks. He didn't know that I was the only person certified with the standards body as the continuing education officer. He didn't know that you have to formally reauthorize someone before you terminate the existing record holder. He didn't know that the CEU dashboard was locked to my encrypted credentials, and without reauthorization, it defaults to ineligible. And that envelope on his desk, it was the last submission. The final update. All he had to do was open it and forward it to the standards agency by Friday. 3 clicks, that's it. But Derek was busy writing LinkedIn posts about disrupting old paradigms. I sat back in my living room, coffee in hand, watching it all play out on the company's press releases and employee message boards, watching them talk about unexpected challenges and temporary compliance delays. They had no idea, but Friday was coming. Silence after humiliation hits different when you know you're the only one holding the ticking bomb. I wasn't angry, not even annoyed. That surprised me. I thought I'd feel more rage, betrayal, some thirst for revenge. But no, I was calm, serene even, like I'd been holding my breath for 8 years and finally let it out. My apartment was quiet. No pings, no Zoom dings, no Derek-flavored emergencies clogging my inbox like a backed-up toilet. Just the hum of my air purifier and the dull buzz of justice brewing under fluorescent lights I didn't have to sit beneath anymore. Thursday morning, HR emailed, "Hi Marcy, hope you're well. We'd appreciate it if you could help us with knowledge transfer regarding your CEU tracking duties. We'd love to get access to any key files or documentation you may have managed. Let us know a good time." Smiling face with smiling eyes, I didn't reply. Not out of spite, just silence. I figured if they wanted access, they could start by opening the envelope still sitting untouched on Derek's desk, like a cursed artifact from a compliance-themed Indiana Jones movie. Meanwhile, I imagined somewhere in the sprawling office, a junior analyst, probably poor Ravi, the guy who once asked me if ISO was a new productivity app, was clicking helplessly through my dashboard. System was built on two-factor authentication tied to my now deactivated badge and personal registration credentials with ISO. Not a single shortcut worked without biometric confirmation or the correct officer of record ID. Every file, every log, every schedule was sealed. I didn't do that to be cruel. I did it because the standards required it. But standards, like most things in that company, were only acknowledged when convenient. Ravi messaged IT. IT, in their infinite wisdom, flagged it as a routine password reset request. A ticket was opened, auto-escalated, marked non-urgent. Derek, when told of the delay, rolled his eyes and waved it off. It's just some login thing. We'll have her files by end of week. End of week. The words sat in my mind like an egg waiting to crack. From what I heard later, someone in legal asked Derek that afternoon if they'd reassigned the role of continuing education officer with ISO. Derek blinked and said, "That's an automatic thing, right?" No one corrected him. No one knew how, because in the org chart, compliance lived in a fog of mystery. We were the janitors of legality, only seen when something smelled wrong. And right now, things were beginning to stink. By Friday morning, procurement froze a shipment. One of our suppliers needed updated ISO documentation before dispatching a 7-figure order. No one could locate the certificate. They searched the shared drive, checked the internal wiki, even opened my old emails. But the document wasn't in any of those places because I never left it there. It was in the submission binder, sealed, signed, and timestamped, ready to be forwarded like always. But no one opened it. No one had the access or the knowledge, know what to do with it. At 10:32 a.m., someone in contracts pinged Derek on Slack. "Hey, can we get confirmation on CEU tracking for this quarter?" The supplier's asking. "Apparently our cert's under review." Derek replied with his usual confidence, "All handled. Minor IT issue. We're streamlining the system anyway." Streamlining. That was his word of choice when dismantling things he didn't understand. Like when he replaced the expense auditing software with a fancy dashboard that couldn't flag duplicate receipts. Or when he eliminated paper backups because cloud equals future, and then lost 2 years of vendor records during a server migration. So now he was streamlining compliance by walking out the only person who knew where the spine of the whole program lived. At home, I brewed a second pot of coffee and took a walk around the block. Leaves were turning. Everything smelled like damp mulch in early October. I felt a weight lifting, not out of vengeance, but inevitability. The machine was winding down, not because I broke it, but because they'd never learned to wind it up themselves. I didn't need to lift a finger. The timer was already set, and they were already late. Monday at 10 o'clock a.m. sharp, because auditors run on clocks, the way surgeons run on heartbeats. Michael L. Carlson of the ISO review board walked through the double glass doors carrying a binder, a laptop, and the energy of a man who doesn't blink when lawyers enter the room. He wore the same blue sport coat he wore every year, the same polished shoes, and the same expression that said, "I don't audit people, I audit systems, and yours better be intact." The receptionist, Kelsey, blinked at him. Do you have an appointment?" He looked at her like she was the one out of place. "Annual ISO 9001 recertification review," he said, pulling a clipboard from his bag and tapping the line with her company's name. "Scheduled 6 months ago. Confirmed by email last week. I'm here for the continuing education officer." Kelsey froze, fingers hovering over her keyboard like they might deflect the incoming catastrophe. Okay. 1 sec." What followed, I later heard, was a 12-minute scramble that involved her paging Derek 3 times, calling HR, and finally resorting to texting someone in finance whose sister once handled a grant audit in college. No one had an answer. When Michael L. Carlson is made to wait, he does not raise his voice. He does not make idle chit-chat. He simply opens his laptop, types a few lines into a tracker, and waits until his watch ticks to the next quarter-hour mark. Then he stands, quietly, calmly. "Need the name of your continuing education officer," he said once more, voice even, eyes fixed on Kelsey. She looked around, then down, then tried, I think, maybe someone in legal or compliance would. He closed the laptop. Your last registered officer of record was Marcy Keller. Her authorization expired 48 hours ago. No new officer has been appointed, and no interim designation has been filed. Silence. You are officially out of compliance. Added, certification has lapsed. We'll be filing a notice of suspension this afternoon. Thank you. He didn't shout. He didn't wait. He simply turned, walked out, and left behind the echo of a nuclear bomb that hadn't made noise yet. At 10:23 a.m., Derek was still in the weekly leadership acceleration huddle when his phone buzzed so violently it nearly skated off the table. Kelsey had sent 4 texts and 1 voicemail that could only be described as a slow-motion car crash. One exec whispered across the table, "Is that the ISO guy at reception?" Another asked, "Wait, wasn't that today?" Derek stood up mid-meeting and stormed out. I imagine he got to the lobby just in time to see Carlson's rental car pulling out of the parking lot. Binder closed. Review aborted. The panic started with Derek yelling, "Why the hell didn't anyone tell me today was the audit?" To no one in particular. Legal, who had reminded him via calendar invite twice, simply looked at him like he'd farted during a funeral. "What do we say?" Someone from finance asked quietly, clutching their laptop like a rosary. "We'll say we have a temp in place," Derek snapped. "We'll say Marcy handed off her files and that the login issue is being handled." But someone whispered, "No temp was ever registered." Derek's face, usually pink with stress or smugness, turned a color I can only describe as toner cartridge gray. HR chimed in, "We emailed her for handoff. She never responded." "And you didn't escalate that?" Derek barked. "She left a submission envelope," someone else muttered. "Did you open it?" There was a pause. "No," he said. "I thought she was just being dramatic." No one replied. At 11:02 a.m., procurement halted 3 open contracts pending updated ISO documentation. Legal flagged potential breach risk for 5 more. By noon, at least one major vendor sent a formal request for current compliance records, with a warning about default clauses. Inside my apartment, I watered my plants and listened to classical piano. I had declined 2 recruiter calls that morning, both suspiciously timed, and accepted a third, a number I recognized, one of our largest clients. Their message was simple. "We heard about your departure. Would love to discuss an opportunity." Derek's empire was now a leaky boat, and I was drying off on shore, and the tide was rising fast. It started with one email. Subject line, "Urgent ISO certification status required." A longtime client, one of the don't rock the boat ones who paid on time and rarely called, sent it directly to the contract's inbox at 12:07 p.m. Monday. The message was polite but firm. "Before finalizing Q4 disbursement, please provide current ISO 9001 documentation as outlined in Section 11B of our agreement." 15 minutes later, a second email arrived, this one from legal at a tech manufacturing partner. "Our internal audit committee requires updated certification proof before approving any procurement pipeline activities." By 1:00 p.m., 3 more emails had landed. 2 used the phrase contractual obligations. 1 hinted at regulatory reporting deadlines. And 1, a particularly cold-blooded message from a federal subcontractor, just attached a highlighted copy of the clause that read, "Valid ISO certification must be maintained throughout the duration of this contract, or the agreement may be rendered void." It didn't take long for the panic to go wide. Legal fired off a group email with a red header. "Immediate action required. Certification documentation." Procurement paused an in-progress $1 million equipment delivery because the contract required ISO compliance at each checkpoint. Shipment sat in a warehouse 80 miles away while the vendor waited for a certificate that no longer existed. Someone in accounting asked if we could just backdate the last certificate to show it's still valid. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bone. And where was Derek during all this? Standing in his office, staring at the sealed binder I'd left on his desk 5 days earlier. Labeled clearly, "Continuing Ed for submission." Time-stamped. Signed, complete, untouched. Flipped it open like it might explode. Inside, a printed list of completed CEU logs, instructor certifications, session attendance records, and the official cover sheet required to file the renewal with ISO. All ready for submission on Friday. All it needed was one action. Forward the contents, digitally or by courier, to the address on the last page. I'd even printed it on company letterhead for him. He hadn't done it. He hadn't even read the cover. Instead, he'd spent Friday firing off optimization memos and brainstorming slogans for the new Q4 growth initiative. He even hosted a company-wide call titled Accelerating Toward the Future, in which he spoke proudly about cutting the fat. Turns out, he just slashed the arteries. By late afternoon, Derek was running around like a man trying to bail water with a stapler. He called IT, demanded emergency access to the compliance portal. IT told him it was encrypted, required biometric login and a valid officer ID. Just override it, he snapped. We can't, they said. It's a third-party system. It's legally tied to Marcy's registration. What about HR? He shouted. They sent her an email. Yes, they said, but she never responded. So call her. Legal stepped in then, voice calm but clipped. We can't ask her to act in any capacity unless she's still designated officer of record. She's not. Derek's forehead started to glisten. Someone handed him a water bottle. He didn't drink it, just stared at it like hydration might fix the contract's hemorrhaging into void. In the hallway, someone whispered, wait, wasn't this literally her job? Another voice, I thought it was just like training stuff. By 4:00 p.m., 5 contracts were frozen. A joint venture partner initiated a compliance inquiry, and word was spreading. Fast. Slack messages started flying. Anyone know what's going on with ISO? Is this going to affect year-end bonuses? Should I be worried about audits? The veneer of calm cracked. Derek stood in the center of the chaos, gripping the binder like it might bite him. His reputation, built on sound bites and shallow metrics, was buckling under the weight of a folder he never bothered to open. He hadn't been sabotaged. He hadn't been plotted against. He'd simply ignored the one thing he couldn't afford to, the quiet function that held his empire together. And the worst part? The damage had only just begun. By Tuesday morning, the boardroom had become a war room. The blinds were drawn. Coffee was being brewed in industrial quantities. Phones buzzed, laptops overheated, and no one had removed their blazers for hours. CFO's assistant brought in a dry erase board that hadn't seen daylight since the last tax overhaul and started scribbling timelines with a shaking hand. At the center of it all sat Derek, eyes rimmed red, tie loosened, collar unbuttoned like it might help oxygen reach his brain. His hair, normally sculpted like it had its own branding strategy, was falling across his forehead in disarray. The air smelled like toner, nerves, whatever panic sweat smells like when it's laced with executive-grade denial. The finance director, Ava, practical, sharp, and known for being allergic to bullshit, spoke first. I did some digging, she said, projecting a spreadsheet onto the screen. The ISO system lists one name, Marcy Keller, as the registered continuing education officer. Derek waved a hand. Yeah, but that must be outdated. We just need to get the new name filed. No, Ava said flatly. You don't understand. That's not how it works. This isn't a LinkedIn title. It's an authorization tied to a named registrant with signature, notarization, and credential verification. Then get her off the list, he snapped. You can't, she replied. Only she could authorize the transfer, and her access was revoked the minute you terminated her. Derek looked around the room. So what? You're telling me we can't just call ISO? We tried. Eagle chimed in, flipping through their folder like it might contain a miracle. They won't speak to anyone unless it's the registered officer of record. They're citing confidentiality clauses and liability shields. She's not even employed here. Derek barked. Exactly, said Ava. So now, no one is. The silence that followed was suffocating. He slumped back into his chair, like gravity had turned spiteful. So what does this mean for the contracts? Legal didn't sugarcoat it. Without a valid officer of record, our continuing education program is non-functional, which, under ISO rules, invalidates our current certification, which, under most of our active contracts, makes us non-compliant, which means breach. Ava finished for her. Clause 14, most of them. Immediate suspension. Termination after 10 business days without remedy. Derek's jaw twitched. Can't we just hire someone new? Refile? Sure, Ava said. It's 2 to 4 weeks for authorization, background check, and credential review. That's assuming we find someone with the right certs, which Marcy had. Uniquely, he stood, paced, pointed to the binder again, now stained with coffee rings and desperation. Then we use this. It's all here, right? Legal nodded, but again, Marcy was the officer. The submission must come from her or her officially appointed successor. There is no successor. She never named one. Ava gave a look that could have iced over a furnace. She wasn't asked to. At 2:47 p.m., an email arrived from ISO confirming what they'd already feared. We regret to inform you that your organization's certification status remains in suspension. Reactivation may only proceed with a registered officer of record. Current status: expired. Derek didn't speak for a long time. He stood at the window, watching the parking lot like he expected Marcy to walk out from behind a Prius and forgive him. Like she'd show up in a cape, hand over the codes, and rescue him from the paperwork avalanche he brought on himself. He whispered, more to himself than the room. She didn't even fight it. She just walked out. That's when Ava, ever the surgical voice of reason, said it out loud, because she didn't need to fight. She knew we'd implode without her. Outside, the sky had gone gray. Inside, the entire company's future was now hanging by a thread of inaction, a single name no longer authorized to help them. And all Derek could do was stand there, sweating through his $1,200 blazer, realizing in real time that the quietest person in the building had been holding the fuse the whole time, and he'd lit it with his own damn match. Wednesday morning began not with a bang, but with an inbox detonation. At 9:12 a.m., notice came in from a federal agency, one of the company's biggest, oldest, and most regulation-obsessed clients. It was short, brutal, governmental in tone. Due to lapse in ISO 9001 compliance status, all current engagements and pending procurements are hereby suspended pending review. This is in accordance with Federal Acquisition Regulation Clause 52.246-11. Translation: they were done. Effective immediately. That single sentence nuked $23 million in active contracts, another $40 million in pending extensions, and vaporized a pipeline 2 years in the making. Someone in contracts gasped. Someone in finance cursed. The general counsel said nothing, just stood and walked quietly out of the meeting room like she needed to go scream into a sink. Derek tried to recover. We can fix this. We'll refile. We'll expedite. The room didn't believe him anymore. They barely even looked at him, and things were about to get worse. At 9:46 a.m., the company's public Twitter account was tagged by a known compliance watchdog, one of those nonprofit audit groups that lives to catch billion-dollar blunders with a single screenshot. Their tweet read, confirmed, company name ISO 9001 certification lapsed 4 days ago. No reauthorization filed. Clients beware. #compliance a failure is all ups. They'd attached a timestamped screen capture of the certification status showing expired. In red, that tweet exploded. By noon, it had been picked up by a mid-tier industry blog. By 2:00 p.m., a journalist from a trade magazine had reached out for comment. Legal declined. PR ghosted them. Internally, it was full DEFCON mode. The stock wobbled. Not a crash, just a slow, sickening teeter. The market itself was raising an eyebrow. It wouldn't take much for investors to notice the smell of panic wafting off every press release now dripping in strategic delay and undergoing internal realignment. At 3:00 p.m., the board convened an emergency review. They summoned Derek. He walked in looking like he'd aged 10 years in 3 days. The presentation he prepared, titled Certification Restoration Pathway, was filled with buzzwords and optimistic projections. None of them mattered, because just before he started speaking, someone slid a tablet across the table. "Check your inbox," a board member said. "You've got a personnel update." He tapped it open, and there it was. A formal announcement from Triarch Systems, their largest long-term strategic partner and the second largest contributor to annual revenue. Proud to welcome Marcy Keller as our new Director of Regulatory Compliance. With over a decade of ISO and CU leadership, Marcy brings unmatched precision and oversight to our growing infrastructure. It even had her photo. Same cardigan, same calm smile. The caption under it said, "She doesn't speak loudly. She doesn't need to." The room went quiet. Derek's mouth moved before his brain did. This must be a mistake. "It's not," said Ava from finance. "I confirmed it. She's on their payroll. She started Monday." "She started Monday?" Board members exchanged looks. One leaned forward. "You terminated her Friday." Derek's face went white, the kind of white that makes you wonder if bone can blush. She didn't even try to fight back," he stammered. Ava said what everyone was thinking, because she wasn't trying to come back. She was already leaving. Outside the boardroom, someone printed the client suspension notice and taped it to the kitchen fridge. A post-it below read, "Guess webinars weren't a waste of time after all." And across town, in a polished office with clean walls and working systems, Marcy sat at her new desk, reviewing digital credentials for a compliance framework already more robust than anything she'd left behind. She had a team now, a budget, a company that knew what her role meant. She wasn't angry. She was focused, because you don't wait around for sinking ships to remember your name. You learn how to swim, and Marcy had already reached the shore. The call came in at 7:41 p.m., blocked number, of course. Marcy was sitting in her new office, the view stretching wide over a city skyline lit like a circuit board. She let it ring twice before answering. She already knew who it was. There's a certain type of silence only cowards carry, heavy, hesitant, thick with desperation and regret. "Marcy," Derek said, voice dry like he hadn't slept or stopped pacing in hours. It's me." She didn't respond immediately. Just leaned back in her chair and looked at the framed ISO compliance certificate on her wall, already updated, already approved. Her name, printed cleanly at the bottom beside the seal. "Can you at least forward the files?" he continued. "The submission forms, the logs, the CE tracker. Anything." Voice was calm. No bite, no fire. Just the kind of still water you don't realize is freezing until you're halfway under. "I submitted them, Derek," she said. "You just never opened them." He tried to chuckle, failed. "Okay, yeah, I deserve that. But seriously, we're hemorrhaging contracts. I need something, anything. Just help me fix this." There was a pause long enough to break something inside him. "Please." She looked at the clock, listened to the hum of her new office's HVAC, silent, unlike the one he never bothered to get fixed in her old cubicle. Then she spoke. That would be a conflict of interest. He made a choking sound. "Come on, don't do this." "I'm not doing anything, Derek," she replied, still gentle, still quiet. "That's the difference between us. I did my job. I followed procedure. I left you exactly what you needed. And you," she stopped herself, then softened, "was to ignore it." He went silent. Then, like a drowning man grasping for driftwood, "Look, I didn't know how important it all was." She tilted her head, eyes narrowing slightly. "That's not true. You knew, you just didn't care." There it was. The truth, quiet and brutal. He tried one more time. "What about the manual, the binder? There's got to be something." She cut him off. "You should check clause 14 of the CE manual. Page 4. He hesitated. What's on page 4? "It explains what happens when certification expires without renewal," she said, in plain English. Then, before he could spiral into more begging, she added, "And Derek, next time you decide to humiliate someone in front of a room full of people, you might want to make sure they don't hold your infrastructure together with 3 login credentials and a signature." He let out a shaky breath. "So that's it?" "No, Derek, that's compliance." Ended the call. The phone screen went dark. She placed it face down on the desk, then turned back to her monitor, already reviewing a draft proposal for a systems audit her new company wanted her to lead. No fireworks, no revenge monologue, just silence, and silence in her hands was a scalpel. Back at her former company, the panic deepened. The binder had been found, yes, but the manual was written in procedural jargon, and no one knew how to navigate it. Clause 14 on page 4 spelled it out in plain terms. Failure to maintain an authorized officer of record invalidates all documentation submitted thereafter. Resubmission may only occur after reauthorization has been formally approved and certified. In other words, the files they needed, useless. The logs, expired. The only person who could fix it had already moved on, and she didn't need to lift a finger to watch it crumble, just had to wait long enough for silence to do what humiliation couldn't. It was Thursday morning when the final nail arrived, not with fireworks or fanfare, but as a 2-page PDF attached to a dry email from the ISO review board. Subject: Official Suspension of Certification Case, #4089B67. The language was sterile, bureaucratic, but the damage was precise and surgical. As of 10 a.m. this morning, her organization is no longer recognized as ISO 9001 compliant. Attempts to rectify submission errors without a valid officer of record were not accepted. Certification will remain suspended until a new officer is approved and all prior documentation is resubmitted. Expected reapproval timeframe: 6-8 weeks. Someone printed it and placed it on the boardroom table like a death certificate. The CEO didn't speak. Eagle sat stone-faced. Ava from finance leaned back, arms crossed, waiting for the meltdown that was now statistically inevitable. Outside the conference room, the fallout had already begun. 3 government agencies formally voided their contracts by 11:45 a.m. One cited breach of compliance. Another cited federal acquisition violations. The third didn't even bother. They just pulled their funding and redirected the work to Triarch Systems. Suppliers followed within hours. By close of day, at least 8 major clients had paused active work or sent inquiries about status. And the Whisper network, always faster than any official memo, spread word through the industry like dry brush catching fire. The company with the broken compliance spine, the one that fired their officer of record, the one where a binder sat untouched until it bled money. And then came Derek. He arrived late to the emergency board session, jaw tight, knuckles pale around a leather folder like he still thought there might be a fix if he just spoke quickly enough. He didn't even make it through the first slide of his recovery strategy deck. The chairman interrupted. "We're not looking for recovery. We're looking for accountability." That was it. 4 words and a silence long enough to bury a career. By 2:00 p.m., an all-staff email went out. Derek Chambers has chosen to resign for personal reasons. Thank him for his service. No one believed a word of it. Not legal, not finance. Certainly not Marcy, who read the email while sipping chamomile tea in a corner of her new office, 10 floors up, sunlight glinting off the clean glass walls like truth finally reflecting through silence. She stood, stretched, and walked a slow lap around the space. It smelled new, like leather, ambition, and eucalyptus from the office diffuser. A plaque hung beside her door now, polished brass, deep black engraving. Director of Regulatory Affairs Marcy Keller. She traced a fingertip across the edge of the letters, then turned to her desk. Bottom drawer, locked, click. She pulled it open slowly. Inside, one sealed binder. Label crisp, edges perfect. Continuing Education Submission Officer of Record. M. Keller identical to the one she left behind. Not out of sentiment, out of principle, because systems only matter when someone gives a damn about maintaining them. And that binder, it wasn't a weapon, it was a warning. She sat down, the city humming beyond the windows. No crowd to cheer, no spotlight, just the quiet relief of knowing she hadn't needed to lift a finger to burn the whole thing down. They'd done it to themselves. All she'd done was walk out and let their neglect finish the story. She looked at the binder one last time, closed the drawer, and murmured to no one in particular, "You were never supposed to open it. You were supposed to care." Big thanks, you legends of the old office days. Subscribe to keep the switch-flicking chaos alive. Your ex-boss is shaking in their loafers.